My name is Henry Cole, and I am a 57-year-old man who never imagined that a simple Friday night out would flip my whole world upside down and turn into a night I would never forget. I had spent most of my life swinging hammers, climbing scaffolds, hauling steel, and watching buildings rise out of dirt because of the work of honest men and good teams. I thought I had seen every kind of trouble, challenge, insult, and hardship a man could face. But nothing prepared me for the night a group of young coworkers told me I was too old to sit at their table in that fancy restaurant. Their eyes slid right past me like I was invisible, like I was just another tired older bloke who showed up in the wrong place. They did not know me. They did not know my past. They did not know what I carried in my hands and in my heart. And they had no idea that the young waiter standing a few feet away knew exactly who I was and what I had done for the men of this town. This is the story of how one night of insult, betrayal, hidden history, jealousy, and truth pushed me down a path I never planned to walk. A path where I would learn that respect has nothing to do with age and everything to do with heart, character, and truth. A path where I discovered who stood with me, who stood against me, and who only pretended to stand anywhere at all. A night where masks came off. A night where old ghosts returned. A night where a stranger became family. And a night where a lie from 20 years ago finally rose out of the shadows and demanded to be faced. So pull up a chair, lean back, and listen, because this is the night I was told I was too old, and the night I proved every one of them wrong. Section 1. The Restaurant and the Insult. I remember walking into that bright, polished restaurant like it happened 5 minutes ago. The place buzzed with life. Voices floated through the air mixed with laughter and clinking glasses, and the warm smell of grilled steak, fresh bread, and sweet butter drifting around like someone painted the air just for a good night out. The lights hung low and soft, glowing across polished wood and smooth tile, making everything look more expensive than it needed to be. People dressed in nice shirts and dresses sat at tables smiling like nothing in the world could bother them. I had spent the whole week working long shifts, and my back still carried the ache of years in construction. But that night, I felt proud standing there in my best dress shirt, fresh shave, and boots cleaned just enough to not look like they had lived on job sites. I saw a group of younger guys from work sitting at a long table near the windows, where the lights from the street outside spilled in like soft gold. They were loud, full of energy, talking over each other, laughing hard and slapping shoulders like life was nothing but a good time. I had worked with them for a few months. I had taught a couple of them how to handle tools safely and how to move as a team on a tight schedule. I figured maybe I would sit with them for once. I was not trying to be one of the boys. Just thought it would be nice to share a meal and not eat alone for a change. A man gets tired of being the shadow in the room. And as much as I act tough, I still wanted to feel included every now and then. So I walked toward their table with a little hope in my chest, thinking maybe I could sit, laugh, and talk like a normal coworker. But the second I reached them, the whole mood changed. The first person to notice me was Darren. He looked up with this smirk that stretched too wide across his face. He nudged the guy next to him with his elbow. Then he looked me up and down like he was sizing up an old piece of equipment that should have been thrown out. He leaned back in his chair, and his voice carried across the table and into my chest. "Mate, this table is for the younger boys. You are too old for this group. Maybe find another spot." Before I even had a chance to react, the rest of them burst into laughs. Not genuine laughs. Sharp, quick, rude laughs. The kind that cut. The kind that burn. The kind meant to be heard by everyone around. For a moment I felt something inside me twist. Not anger. Not shame. Just that quiet sting a man feels when someone strips his dignity with no reason. I stood there trying to hold myself together. Trying to breathe steady. Trying not to show how deep that bruise went. I did not yell. I did not spit back. At 57, I learned yelling rarely wins a fight worth winning. So I just nodded even though inside, I felt something heavy settle in my chest. I turned around slow hopping. The moment would pass quietly. But then a steady calm voice spoke behind me. A voice that felt like a hand catching me before I fell. "Mr. Cole, you can sit with me. If anyone here thinks you are too old, then maybe they are too young to understand what respect means." I turned. It was the waiter. Tall, lean, early 20s. His accent was mostly American, but here and there I could hear a light Aussie edge, like he grew up hearing both sides of the world in his home. His eyes met mine, and there was no pity in them. Only something solid. Something real. Respect. The whole table froze. Darren forced out a fake laugh. "Since when does a waiter talk like that? Stay in your lane, mate." But the waiter did not move. Did not back down. Did not blink. He stood like a man who already knew he was on the right side of things. "Sir," he said, "you have done more in your life than these lads even know. I recognized your name when I checked the bookings, and I looked you up. You are Henry Cole, the man who helped build half the structures in this town. The man who trained the older crews. Some of them fathers to these boys sitting right here." Suddenly the table went silent. The laughs fell away like someone switched them off. The boys stared at me with wide eyes like they were seeing a whole different person. My heart thumped in my chest because the young waiter knew more about my life than these lads I worked beside for months. I slowly pulled out the chair he offered, and as I sat down, I felt something shift in the air. Not anger, not pride, just truth. Truth that should have been known long ago. The boys looked down or looked away because now they realized something simple. Age does not erase worth. Ignorance does. But what I did not know, what none of us knew, was that this small moment, this tiny act of kindness, was about to drag me into a night filled with old lies, jealous rivals, a hidden enemy, and a truth that had waited 20 years to rise back to the surface. And all of it began with a waiter who knew my name. When I finally settled into that chair beside the young waiter who had stepped up for me, I felt something shift inside my chest, something I had not felt in a long time, like someone had finally seen me, not the age on my face or the gray on my jaw, but the man underneath. The waiter stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes calm yet sharp, like he had already made up his mind to protect me before the night even began. His name, he told me, was Mason. He said it with the kind of quiet confidence you only hear in men who have grown up around real strength. Not loud, not boastful, steady. He leaned just slightly in my direction as he placed a menu in front of me, and his voice dropped to a level only I could hear. He said he had known my name long before tonight, that his father, Mark Cavanaugh, had worked under me on a series of old building sites almost 20 years back. The moment he said his father's name, the memories rushed in. The long, dusty summers, the heavy steel beams, the smell of sweat and iron, and a younger man, his father, laughing and wiping his forehead with his sleeve before picking up his tools again. I hadn't thought of that man in years, but suddenly there he was again, alive in the eyes of his son. Mason told me that when he was a kid, his father used to come home late, exhausted but proud, and he would sit at the kitchen table telling stories of the men on the site, the ones he respected and the ones he swore he'd never work with again. And in nearly every story about fairness, leadership, or standing up for a guy who was getting crushed by the system, he always mentioned my name. Not as a hero, not as some legend, just as a man who didn't let anyone fall behind. A man who didn't leave people in the dirt. A man who taught others how to stand tall even on the days when your back was breaking under the weight of the world. Hearing that, it hit me hard, harder than I expected. You spend years believing your best days are behind you, thinking nobody remembers the good you've done, thinking the world just replaces you with younger faces and you fade into the background like old wallpaper. And then out of nowhere, a kid with clear eyes and a steady voice tells you that you never faded at all. You lived on through people you didn't even know were watching. But while that warmth touched me for the first time in years, the table behind us had gone silent, completely silent. Those boys who had laughed at me only minutes ago were now stiff, their eyes darting around like they'd missed something important. They had mocked me because they thought they knew better, thought age meant weakness, thought gray hair meant irrelevance. They had judged me in a split second the same way many do when they see someone older, automatically assuming you are slow, outdated, unimportant. But now they were faced with something they didn't expect at all, a truth they hadn't bothered to look for. As Mason took my order, his voice respectful, his tone warm, he leaned closer again, his eyes still scanning the group of boys at the long table. He said something I didn't expect to hear from someone so young. "Sir, I think something is off tonight." His voice was calm, but there was a tightness around the edges, a kind of alertness that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. He told me those boys weren't just rude, not the usual kind of immaturity you see from young men who think life owes them something. No, he said they had been whispering about me long before I arrived, that he had overheard pieces of conversation, little fragments of sentences, and the tone of those whispers wasn't casual gossip. It had weight, it had intention, it had preparation. "Someone told them something," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "Someone painted the wrong picture of you." A cold heaviness spread across my stomach, the kind that sinks deep and refuses to move. I had felt something strange when I walked into the restaurant, like a wrong note in a piece of music you can't quite explain. A kind of tension that didn't belong in the warm glow of a Friday night, but I dismissed it, telling myself I was imagining things. Now I knew I wasn't. Trouble, real trouble, rarely comes uninvited, and it never shows up without a reason. I told Mason that I couldn't think of anyone who would want to set me up for humiliation in front of a bunch of younger workers. I didn't owe these boys anything, and they didn't owe me anything either. But Mason gave me a look, one of those looks that tells you without words that you're missing something large, something sitting right behind you that you haven't turned around to see yet. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it's not the people you think who start the fire. It's the person standing behind them, holding the match." As the plates began to come out of the kitchen, I watched the boys out of the corner of my eye. Their whispers didn't stop. Their glances at me grew sharper, quicker, like they were waiting for something, like they were following a script. Their smirks curled in the corners of their mouths every few minutes, the kind of smirks that weren't natural, weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed. That was when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't random disrespect. Something deeper was buried underneath this night, like a current beneath the ocean pulling everything to the rocks. Then Darren stood. Of course it was Darren, the loudest man at the table, the one who had dismissed me first, the one who fed off attention like it was oxygen. He raised his glass and tapped it with a fork, loud enough that every head turned his way. The restaurant quieted just a bit, not fully silent, but enough that his voice could travel across the tables like a spotlight. He had a wide grin plastered across his face, but it wasn't real. I had seen men like him all my life. Men who hid insecurity behind noise. Men who laughed loud so nobody would notice the fear trembling inside them. "Our old mate Henry is joining us tonight," he announced, stretching each word like a cheap stage performer. "A legend in his own mind." The boys tried to chuckle, but it sounded forced, awkward. Darren went on, louder, bitterer. "Rumor says he got kicked off a major site years ago. Apparently old Henry messed up the steelwork and cost the company thousands." Then he burst into a laugh so big and fake it echoed across the tiles. The table erupted in uneasy laughter, sharp, unsteady, embarrassed. But it didn't take long for something to shift. The laughter began to fade, one by one, like someone was turning down a dial. Because they suddenly noticed Mason standing right behind Darren, still holding a tray, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. Not in anger, but in something far more dangerous. The need to speak the truth. When Mason finally opened his mouth, the room felt like it leaned his direction. He spoke calmly, with a respect that made his words even sharper. "Sir, that rumor is false," he said, steady and clear. "I know because my father was on that site." The boys froze. Henry didn't mess up anything. He saved that job. Someone else made the mistake, and Henry stayed late for 3 nights straight fixing it. The boys stared at each other, confusion ripping across their faces. They looked like kids who'd been handed a puzzle missing half its pieces. Their confidence cracked. Their bravado dissolved. Because now they realized the story they had been fed wasn't just wrong, it was poisoned. And whoever fed it to them had a reason. A long-forgotten instinct woke up inside me. An instinct built over decades on construction sites where lies spread faster than fire and the smallest rumor could cost a man his job, his reputation, even his entire career. When someone spreads lies behind your back, it is never by accident. There is always a hand behind the curtain, pulling the strings. As I sat there, feeling the weight of the room shift again, I understood something crystal clear. Someone wanted me humiliated tonight. Someone wanted these boys to believe the worst about me. Someone wanted me small, crushed, disgraced. And that someone wasn't sitting at that table. They were hiding behind it. The night was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And as the truth slowly surfaced, I could smell betrayal in the air, thick, heavy, close enough to touch. Because whoever had started this wasn't finished. Not even close. The moment Mason whispered that someone was watching me, a cold stillness slid across my shoulders, the kind that crawls under a man's skin and sits there like a warning. I didn't turn right away. Years on construction sites teach you that the fastest way to reveal fear is to move too quickly. Instead, I let my eyes shift slowly, letting the edges of the room come into focus one corner at a time. People ate, people laughed, glasses clinked, conversations drifted over the tables. But beneath all that noise, there was a tremor of something else, something aimed at me. When I finally looked toward the corner Mason had mentioned, just a small turn of my head as if I was stretching my neck, I saw him. Sitting alone at a table near the far wall, a half-finished drink in front of him, posture relaxed in a way that wasn't natural. A way that told me he was waiting, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see the hit land. And when my eyes locked on his, the room around me fell away like someone had pulled the ground from under my feet. My breath didn't just stop, it froze. Marcus Hale. The name alone tasted like rust and old anger in my mouth, a name I had buried deep under years and years of trying to be better than the past, a name I hoped I would never have to say out loud again. But there he was, flesh and bone, older but still carrying the same bitterness on his face. His hair had more gray, his jaw was sharper, and there were new lines across his forehead, lines etched by years of holding grudges. But the eyes were the same, hard, calculating. Full of resentment he had never let go. It hit me like a punch to the ribs. Of all the men I wished never to see again, Marcus Hale was at the top of the damn list. For a moment I didn't hear the restaurant anymore. My mind spun backward 20 years, back to that nightmare of a construction site where everything had gone wrong. Back when Marcus and I had worked side by side, though he never wanted to stand beside me, he wanted to stand above me. He wanted titles. He wanted attention. He wanted every worker to follow him like he was their savior. But the truth was, the crew trusted me, not him. Because leadership isn't about shouting orders. It's about being the first one on the ground and the last one out when the job gets rough. He didn't understand that. He hated that. And he especially hated the steel work incident, the one he caused, the one I fixed, the one that had nearly cost the company everything, the one the city still remembered, because that building became one of the proudest landmarks around, a building that stood tall because I refused to let it fall. But Marcus never forgave me for saving the day. He wanted me blamed. He wanted me fired. He wanted his story, the story where he was the hero, to be the one people remembered. And when that didn't happen, when the truth came out and he was reprimanded instead of praised, he walked off that site with hatred boiling in his chest like a storm he swore he'd unleash someday. And apparently, someday had arrived. Because now I realized the lies the young workers repeated tonight weren't random. They weren't misunderstandings. They were seeds seeded by him, fed to them intentionally, whispered in the right ears, timed perfectly for the moment I walked into the restaurant. Marcus wanted the humiliation to cut deep, to happen in public, to be witnessed. He wanted those boys to laugh at me before he showed himself. He wanted to see the insult land before he stepped out of the shadow. Mason must have felt the shift in my breathing because he placed a steady hand on my forearm, just gently, the way someone touches a wire before they decide if it's live or not. His voice was low. "Sir, stay calm. That man didn't show up here by accident, and those boys didn't say what they said by accident either." He was right. Everything in my gut told me this wasn't coincidence. Marcus didn't just happen to walk into the same restaurant. He had been waiting, watching, studying. Maybe he even knew where I'd be tonight. Maybe he had pushed those boys for days, maybe weeks, feeding them the twisted lies he had rehearsed for years. He wanted to make sure that when he finally resurfaced in my life, it would be at the moment he believed I was the weakest, outnumbered, embarrassed, dismissed by younger men who didn't know any better. I looked back at Marcus, and I swear the man was staring at me like he was reading a book he had already memorized. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He didn't pretend to be subtle. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to feel it. The corners of his mouth curled slowly upward, not into a smile, but into a grin, thin, poisonous, crooked. A grin that said everything he didn't need to speak out loud. A grin that said, "I finally got you, old man." It felt like the air around me thickened, like the lighting dimmed just for him. My heartbeat slowed to a heavy thump. Not fear, anger. Anger so old it tasted like smoke. Anger I had buried because I thought I'd never need it again. But tonight, that old part of me, the part that used to fight through lies, through sabotage, through men like Marcus Hale, woke up again. I could feel Mason's eyes on me, watching my expression, trying to read what this moment meant. He didn't know the whole story, but he understood one thing perfectly: the energy in the room had changed. This wasn't a simple night out gone wrong. This wasn't a random insult from immature workers. This was a setup, a trap, something planned down to the smallest detail. Because Marcus Hale didn't come to Restaurant Corners to enjoy a peaceful dinner. He came to watch my humiliation unfold like a show he had paid for, like revenge served on a silver platter. And sitting there, staring directly at the man who had once tried to destroy not just my reputation but my livelihood, I knew deep in my bones that this night was headed somewhere darker, somewhere deeper, somewhere I never expected to go at my age. Because Marcus Hale didn't just return by chance. He returned with a purpose. And that purpose was me. The night wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. The tension in the restaurant felt heavy enough to bend steel. It pressed down on my shoulders and tightened around my chest like a slow, thick fog that would not clear. It was strange how quickly the night shifted from a simple dinner to something that felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. The boys sat stiff in their seats now. They did not look proud anymore. Their earlier laughter had died off like a cheap battery running out. Even the loudest one, Darren, stared down at the table with a stiff jaw. And in the corner, Marcus still sat watching me with the calm, cold patience of a hunter who already knows where his prey will run. His drink stayed untouched, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his eyes never leaving me. Mason moved around the table with the controlled steps of a man ready for trouble. You could see it in the way his shoulders stayed tight, the way his jaw locked, the way he glanced toward Marcus every few seconds like he was tracking a hazard. He was only a young bloke, but his instincts were sharp as any seasoned worker on a dangerous site. Something in him already knew this night was not going to end simple. Then out of nowhere the silence broke when one of the younger guys named Tyler cleared his throat. His voice came out shaky and unsure, like he was afraid of the words he was about to speak. It was the kind of voice a man uses when he knows he has crossed a line he never understood. He stared at me with wide, guilty eyes and said, "Henry, we did not mean to be harsh. We were told things about you. We were told you lied about your past. that you claimed you saved buildings when you actually messed them up. We were told you got men fired, that you ruined whole crews. We thought you were just some old, washed-up bloke bragging about the past. His words felt like someone throwing rocks directly at my chest one by one without stopping, not because they hurt my pride, but because they were lies aimed at destroying the very thing I cared most about. In my whole working life, I never once betrayed a crew. I never blamed another man for my mistakes. I never twisted a story to make myself look better. I always protected my men, even when it meant arguing with management or staying after hours to fix what others had done wrong. Everything I built in life was rooted in honesty and hard work. Hearing those lies spoken out loud felt like having years of sweat and sacrifice burned down in a second. I leaned toward Tyler with a slow, steady breath and asked him who told you that. His eyes flicked to the far corner almost unwillingly. A small tremor ran through his voice as he answered, "Marcus. He came by our site yesterday. He said he used to work with you. He said he wanted to warn us about you." I felt something in my stomach drop like a weight pulling me down. There it was, the truth, the whole setup. Marcus had not just planned tonight. He had planted the seeds before the night even began. He walked right onto their job site and filled their heads with lies. He made sure they would see me as a washed-up embarrassment. He made sure the humiliation would be ready and waiting when I walked into the restaurant. He wanted them to strike first so he could sit in the corner and enjoy the show. And suddenly something clicked inside me, something that made the whole thing larger than just old grudges. Marcus had not tried to ruin my name for 20 years. He waited until now, until these specific boys, until this specific moment. But why now? What changed? What made him crawl out of the shadows after all these years? Before I could chase the thought any further, the restaurant lights flickered. Just a small flash, but sharp enough to make every head in the room lift like they felt a sudden chill. The overhead lights dimmed, then brightened again. Mason immediately looked around like a man who recognized a warning before anyone else did. His voice was low and tense as he said, "That is strange, sir. We never get power dips here. Something is off. Someone might be messing with something in the back." The moment he said that, my whole body stiffened, because the kind of man Marcus was, the kind of hate he carried, the way he set things up, none of it stopped at words. None of it ended with gossip or humiliation. Marcus was not the type to plan half a revenge. He liked full destruction. He liked watching things crumble. He liked pulling strings and waiting for the chaos to hit. And the flicker of the lights told me this night had deeper layers than insults. Something else was in motion, something bigger than a table of boys repeating lies, something connected to Marcus sitting there with that wicked, slow grin, something that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. My gut twisted in the same way it used to twist on dangerous job sites right before a beam snapped or a scaffold shifted. The way it twisted when something in the air told me to step back before disaster struck. I realized then that this was not just a night gone wrong, not just a petty scheme, not just old bitterness resurfacing. Marcus wanted more. He wanted something that reached past reputation, past pride, past the past itself. We were stepping into a storm, and he was the one who built it. The air inside the restaurant shifted the moment things took a darker turn. It wasn't something you could see. It wasn't even something you could name. It was a pressure, a tightening inside the walls themselves, as if the building sensed what was coming before any of us did. The boys who had been loud earlier, the ones who mocked me with careless confidence, were now quieter, their bodies tense, their shoulders stiffening without meaning to. Even the sound of glassware clinking against tables felt sharper, harsher, like the room was warning us that the night had cracked open, and there was no sealing it shut again. Mason walked toward me fast, his steps uneven, the worry on his face something he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. He leaned in close, lowering his voice even though the room was loud enough to swallow anything. "Sir, you need to hear this, and I need you to stay calm." His tone made my stomach tighten. When a young man speaks with that kind of caution to someone twice his age, you know something bigger than inconvenience has happened. Something calculated. Something meant to wound. I nodded for him to continue. My manager just pulled me aside, he whispered. There was a system breach earlier today. Not a glitch, a hack. Someone got into our booking software. Someone erased original reservations, switched tables around, altered staff access. And whoever did it used your name, sir. They forged your identity to make the system think it was you. For a moment, all the noise around me dimmed into a slow, distant hum. My mind locked onto one single question. Why? Why would someone go through that much trouble just to move me from one table to another? Why hack a restaurant system just to place me in this precise spot, directly across from those boys, right in the most visible corner of the whole place, like a man put on trial in public without being told the charges? Then it clicked. Because humiliation works best when it has an audience. Because reputation dies fastest when people are watching. Because Marcus wasn't here by accident. He was coordinating this night piece by piece like a blueprint, designed to collapse one beam at a time. The thought made my heart beat slow and heavy, like each thump was dragging a memory behind it. I stood, not fast, not aggressive, just steady. I felt the weight in my legs, the kind that comes not from fear but from experience, from knowing exactly when a confrontation is no longer something you walk around but something you walk straight into. Marcus was sitting in the far corner, the same spot Tyler had glanced toward earlier. He didn't hide. He didn't look away. He watched me the entire walk, the way a man watches a flame he started himself, waiting to see how far it spreads before the fire department shows up. He gave me a grin, not wide, not friendly, just that smug half-curve that tells you the person has been waiting a long time for this moment. "Henry," he said slowly, still standing, even after all these years. His voice sounded older, rougher, but the bitterness in it was still young, still sharp, still alive. Old grudges never lost their teeth. They simply waited for chances to bite again. I stopped in front of him, no anger in my voice, just truth. Why tonight? Why these boys? Why lie to them? Why stir up old poison? He tapped his fingertips on the table, one slow beat at a time, like a countdown no one else could hear. "Because," he said, "you took my future from me." I felt my jaw tighten, the past pushing itself into the present like an old wound tearing open again. "You took my credit," he continued, "my respect, my job, my legacy." The room around us faded. It was just him and me now, two men tied together by a history neither of us asked for, but both of us suffered from. "I didn't take anything from you," I said. "I saved that job site. You ruined it with your shortcuts and you know that. You put men at risk. I pulled them out. That's not stealing your legacy, that's preventing a disaster." He leaned forward until I could see the veins pulsing in his forehead. "And that," he murmured, "is exactly why I'm here, because you walked away the hero, because you walked away with honor, and me." His voice cracked with rage. "I walked away with nothing. You didn't just ruin my job, Henry, you destroyed the life I was supposed to build." His eyes were bloodshot, wild, the kind that no longer saw reason, only targets. "I want you," he whispered, "to feel what I felt." The words hit harder than I expected, not because of the threat. I'd heard enough threats in my life, but because he truly believed it. He had carried this venom for decades. He hadn't just been waiting, he had been planning, nourishing his anger, turning it into something he could finally use tonight. Then he added something, something that sucked the last bit of warmth out of the room. "This night isn't over, Henry. I've waited too long to let you walk away without losing something." Mason appeared at my side so fast I didn't even see him coming. He stepped between us defensively, one hand slightly raised like a shield. "Sir, please step back." He looked at Marcus with full alertness. "This man isn't stable. Something's wrong with him." He was right. Even without touching him, you could feel it, that unsettling energy of a person who'd made up their mind to break something, to shatter someone, and didn't care about the consequences anymore. Marcus's eyes were burning in a way that didn't belong to the man I once knew. It belonged to someone who had let hatred grow for 20 years without trimming a single branch. And the worst part, he wasn't done. Not even close. The night was still young, and Marcus had come prepared to make it unforgettable in the worst possible way. The walls around us felt thinner, like they were about to collapse inward, and deep in my gut I knew. We were only standing at the edge of the storm. The real destruction was still waiting, just past the next hour. The air inside the restaurant had already been heavy, but now it thickened into something almost physical, like a fog you could choke on. The tension wasn't just emotional anymore, it was structural. The beams above us felt tight, the floorboards seemed to hold their breath, and every person inside sensed that something had shifted, something they didn't have a name for, but every instinct warned them to brace themselves. The manager appeared from the hallway, motioning urgently for Mason. Even from a distance I could tell something was wrong. Managers don't call their servers like that unless something serious has happened, and the look in his eyes said this wasn't a spilled drink or a customer complaint. This was deeper, darker. Mason gave me one last look before heading toward the back, a look that said more than words ever could. Stay sharp, keep your guard up, something's brewing. I stayed close to the boys. Their earlier bravado was gone, wiped clean by the truth they had learned. Tyler's hands were shaking, Darren kept rubbing his neck like he was trying to calm himself, and the rest of them stared at the floor, whispering quiet apologies that sounded like guilt trying to breathe. I didn't hold any of it against them. They were kids compared to me, still learning the difference between stories and truth. They had been manipulated, and the weight of that realization was settling on their shoulders faster than they expected. I waved the apologies off softly. "It's bigger than all that," I murmured. And it was. The boys were only pawns in a game they didn't know they had stepped into. Then it happened, the moment the night cracked open. A loud crash erupted from the back of the restaurant. Not a normal sound, not a tray of dishes slipping or a glass falling. This was a violent break, sharp, echoing, amplified by the narrow hallways. People gasped. A woman near the window screamed and forks clattered against plates as the entire dining room froze mid-motion. The lights flickered again, this time more violently than before, dimming just long enough for the room to feel the cold spine of fear run through it. You could hear plates smashing somewhere out of sight, someone shouting orders in panic, the unmistakable scrape of furniture being knocked over. Mason burst from the back hallway like someone had pushed him forward. He was pale, almost gray, breathing hard. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "someone cut the breaker room wires." A chill dropped straight into my stomach. "All our security cameras are down," he continued. "Phones at the front desk are dead too. Someone wants this place blind, and someone wants it silent." You could hear the weight of those words hit the room. Conversations died instantly. Even children at nearby tables stopped fidgeting and looked around with wide eyes. A couple near the bar leaned in closer to each other, unsure whether to stay or flee. Darren swallowed hard. "Mate, what is happening? Are we in some kind of trap?" He didn't know it, but that's exactly what it felt like. A trap designed with precision, baited with the past, set to spring at the perfect moment. And the man who set it all in motion didn't hide anymore. Marcus stood from his chair in the corner. Not suddenly, not aggressively. He stood with the calmness of someone who had already rehearsed this moment countless times in their mind. The low restaurant lights cast his silhouette long across the wall, stretching him into something larger, darker, almost theatrical. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood in the center of the room like he owned every square inch of it. He didn't bother with subtlety now. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted the audience. He wanted everyone to hear him. He lifted his chin and raised his voice so it carried through the entire dining area. "Everyone here should know something," he announced, his tone cold but loud. "This man," he pointed at me with a trembling, angry hand, "Henry, has lived a lie his whole life." People turned. Dozens of eyes shifted toward me instantly, some confused, some frightened, some curious, all caught in the gravity of the moment. "He stole a job from me," Marcus continued. "Stole my career. He destroyed my life, and he walked away as if he were some kind of hero." Murmurs spread like ripples. No one knew what story they had stepped into, but everyone could feel it was dangerous. The air around Marcus seemed charged, electric with rage. I stepped forward, not because I wanted to, but because it was time. His lies had tasted the air long enough. "You destroyed your own life," I said, my voice steady, controlled. "I saved that sight, and you've spent 20 years blaming every person except the one in the mirror." My words didn't calm the room, they deepened the tension. You could feel it through the floor like vibrations from an approaching storm. People watched with bated breath, unsure whether they were about to witness an argument or something much worse. Mason rushed to my side, his steps quick, his hands trembling but braced with courage. He planted himself close enough that his shoulder brushed mine. "Sir," he whispered urgently, "you don't need to face him alone." I felt a strange mix of gratitude and worry. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a battlefield disguised as a dinner setting. And Mason, young, brave, loyal, was stepping into danger he couldn't see the full shape of. But I wasn't afraid. Not of Marcus. Not of whatever hatred had been brewing inside him for 2 decades. I had lived through worse storms, survived more dangerous men, carried heavier burdens. What did scare me, though, wasn't Marcus's presence, it was his plan. Because he wasn't here tonight to shame me. He wasn't here to argue or to demand apologies. He wasn't here for a confrontation. He was here for ruin. He had cut wires. He had shut down cameras. He had destroyed communications. He had turned a restaurant full of innocent people into a sealed box. This wasn't humiliation anymore. This was escalation. This was danger. This was the moment when something small and ugly turned into something uncontrollable. Marcus wasn't just angry, he was prepared. And the smell in the air, the sharp metallic tension, the silent dread settling over the tables told me one thing. He wasn't even close to done. The night hadn't reached its peak. It was only winding tighter, ready to snap. For a moment, the entire restaurant held its breath. Marcus stood in the middle of the room like a man ready to ignite the night, ready to turn everyone against me, ready to twist the truth until he stood victorious on the ruins of my reputation. His eyes gleamed with that twisted confidence of someone who believed he had already won. But before he could stir the room further, before he could spit out another lie or raise his voice to control the crowd again, Mason stepped forward, not fearfully, not cautiously, but with a kind of boldness that seemed to rise from deep inside him, a strength that surprised even me. When he spoke, his voice was louder than it had been all night, deeper, charged with something that silenced the room faster than any threat Marcus could make. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying across the tables, bouncing off the walls, "please listen. You want the truth. I will tell you the truth." Those words hit the air like a hammer. Conversations died instantly. Chairs stopped shifting. Even the soft clinking of cutlery ceased as people turned their heads, drawn in by the command in his voice. Mason wasn't just talking, he was standing up, stepping into something bigger than himself. He wasn't defending a customer. He wasn't defending an elder. He was defending a man he believed deserved justice. He began telling the room everything he knew. He spoke of the stories his father told him since he was a boy, stories of me. How I led teams with fairness, how I stood up for younger workers, how I shielded those who didn't know how to shield themselves, how I fixed things in silence without begging for credit. He explained how I stayed late after everyone else went home, how I stepped into danger when others stepped back, how I never let a crew fall apart under my watch. His voice softened when he said it, as if he were speaking of a mentor he admired, a figure he knew only through memories his father had passed down like treasured lessons. The room drew in closer. You could feel people leaning forward in their seats, some resting elbows on tables as if they didn't want to miss a single word. Even the group of boys who had mocked me earlier stared at Mason with eyes wide, their harshness replaced with something almost childlike, curiosity mixed with shame. Then Mason said something that struck the room like lightning. "Sir," he said, looking at me first, then turning to the crowd, "my father kept records, notes from the sites. He documented everything because he wanted accuracy, because he wanted truth." Mason took a breath, steady and sure. "And those notes prove something none of you knew." You could see people stiffen, waiting, bracing. He continued, "My father was the one who fixed the steel beams after Marcus damaged them. Henry didn't cause that disaster, he prevented it. He found the fault before it collapsed. He saved the job, saved the men, and saved the company." A collective gasp moved through the room, a wave of shock rippling from table to table. Even people who didn't know a thing about construction understood what they had just heard. Fixing something someone else broke is one thing, but catching it before it kills someone, that is another level of responsibility. The air changed. Respect replaced doubt. Truth replaced the poison Marcus had spread for years. Marcus froze. He didn't blink. His arms hung stiff at his sides as if the truth had cut the strings that let him move. His face, once smug and triumphant, drained of color as if someone had pulled the life right out of him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. His lips trembled. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted from left to right like he was searching for a way out of his own lie. But Mason wasn't done, not even close. "My father sent me those notes years ago," he said, lifting his phone with steady hands. "I still have them, right here. This is not opinion, this is not memory, this is proof." He raised the phone high enough that everyone in the restaurant could see it glowing in his hand, a beacon of truth in a room that had nearly been swallowed by lies. For the first time that night, Marcus stumbled backward, one foot sliding behind the other as if the floor had tilted underneath him. His hands shook violently now. He looked older suddenly, smaller, weaker, like a man whose mask had finally fallen and left nothing behind but the naked truth he had tried to bury. "You cannot use that," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking like thin glass. "It was years ago. It doesn't matter anymore, it's irrelevant, it doesn't count." But the room didn't care about years. They didn't care about time. They cared about truth. And they had finally seen it exposed, undeniable, undeniable enough to rewrite everything they thought they knew. Tyler stepped toward me first, slowly, like he wasn't sure he had the right after everything he'd said earlier. But he lifted his chin, steadied his breath, and spoke with a sincerity that vibrated through the room. "Henry, we were wrong, all of us. We judged you based on someone else's lies. We believed the wrong person." Darren lowered his head, rubbing the back of his neck in shame. "I'm sorry, mate," he muttered, eyes heavy. "We shouldn't have treated you like that. We shouldn't have listened to him." The boys gathered around me like a small protective circle, not out of obligation but out of remorse. Their earlier mockery seemed distant now, replaced by genuine respect. For a moment the room softened, the tension cracked just enough for light to slip through. You could feel the atmosphere shift, warm with apologies, heavy with realization, touched by a sense of justice. For a brief heartbeat, for a fragile blink of time, hope rose in the room. The truth had finally spoken. The lies had finally been exposed. And Marcus's power had finally, brutally collapsed. But hope in nights like this never stays long. Because a man like Marcus, a man who has fed on resentment for 20 years, a man who has built his entire identity around blame and bitterness, does not stop when cornered. He does not surrender. He does not admit defeat. When exposed, he becomes dangerous. When humiliated, he becomes desperate. And when desperate, he becomes unpredictable. And as the truth hung in the air, shining like a blade, the look on Marcus's face told me everything. This night wasn't ending with truth. It was only shifting into something darker. Everything inside the restaurant shifted the moment the truth stripped Marcus bare. It was like watching a storm lose its thunder, watching a wave collapse before it could reach the shore. His breath quickened first, sharp, unsteady, almost animal-like. You could see his chest rising too fast, too high, as if he couldn't pull enough air into his lungs. His eyes darted around the room, frantic, searching for something to hold onto, a lie, a supporter, a piece of control, anything that would keep him standing. But the more he looked, the more helpless he appeared. He saw only faces staring back at him with judgment, confusion, disappointment, and the cold sting of truth. His lies were gone. His revenge had cracked. His ego was collapsing in on itself like a damaged beam finally snapping under pressure. His hands curled into fists, not out of strength but desperation. His jaw trembled as he swallowed hard, his throat bobbing like he was choking on the silence. And then something inside him broke. You could almost hear it, not a sound in the room, but a sound inside the man. A final snap in his spirit when he realized everything he had orchestrated, everything he had planned, every twisted intention that had simmered in him for 20 long years, had fallen apart in a single night. And in front of witnesses. Then he lunged. Not with a knife, not with a hidden weapon, but with raw, reckless rage. The kind of rage that doesn't think, doesn't pause, doesn't see consequences. His whole body shot toward Mason like he was trying to latch onto the last person he could blame, the last person he could drag down with him. His movements were messy, frantic, almost shaking as if anger itself was the only thing holding him upright. But before his hands could reach the young man, my body moved on its own. There wasn't time for thought. Instinct took over, the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life watching over younger workers, protecting those who didn't know danger until it hit them. My arms came up and spread wide, my chest firm, my stance planted deep into the floor. I blocked Marcus with everything I had left, with strength I thought had faded with age, with a kind of fire that still lived in me even after the years had carved their lines across my face. Marcus slammed against me. His body wasn't strong, it was desperate. He stumbled back from the impact, wobbling as if he couldn't believe I had stopped him so easily. And for the first time that night, he didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like the mastermind who hacked systems, spread lies, manipulated young men, and tried to rewrite my past. He didn't look like the man who walked in with a grin carved from spite. He looked small, weak, lost. He looked like a man who had chased hatred so long, he didn't remember who he was without it. His shoulders sagged, his knees bent, his hands dropped to his sides. The fire in his eyes fizzled into a dull, shattered glow. He stood there breathing in short, broken huffs, staring at me as if trying to understand how everything had turned against him so quickly, and how I had become the wall he could not break. Behind me, Mason stood still, safe, protected, but the determination in his eyes had only grown. He wasn't shaking anymore. He looked like he had found his voice, his strength, his purpose. He wasn't the quiet waiter who first invited me to sit. He had turned into something stronger, someone willing to stand for truth even when it put him in danger. Then the lights flickered. A groan rolled through the building as partial power kicked back on. Dim bulbs glowed back to life. The restaurant pulsed with a weary breath as the systems came crawling back online. In the shifting light, everything looked clearer: Marcus's face, drained and trembling, the boy's expressions, tight with guilt, Mason's steady posture, mine firm as bedrock. From the back rooms came the sound of hurried footsteps. Security staff rushed into the dining area, scanning the room, trying to understand why the place felt charged like a fight had just ended. The restaurant manager followed close behind, his voice low and controlled as he issued directions. People moved, chairs scraped, staff stepped between Marcus and the rest of us. But Marcus didn't resist. There was no fight left in him. His shoulders sagged even more as security gently took hold of his arms. Not harshly, not violently, just firmly, like handling a man whose fire had burned out, leaving only ash behind. He let them guide him toward the exit. Each step he took looked heavier than the last, like he was walking through memories he wished he could erase but couldn't escape. His shoes dragged. His breathing stayed uneven. And before he crossed the threshold of the door, he stopped and turned his head, looking back at me with eyes that no longer held anger but something far more empty. His voice came out thin, barely more than a whisper, the last thread he had left. "You ruined me." It wasn't accusation anymore. It wasn't rage. It was pain. Years of it. Decades maybe. Wounds he never healed, mistakes he never admitted, bitterness he let rot inside him until it became the only thing he knew. I stepped closer, not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with the truth he needed to hear, the truth he had been running from for 20 years. "No, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, grounded, tired, but honest. "You ruined yourself." The words hung between us, heavy but freeing, cold but fair. He blinked once, the last piece of denial falling from his eyes, and then he looked away. The security guards led him out through the door into the cold night, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness outside. And inside the restaurant, the storm finally broke. After Marcus was finally taken out of the building, after the echoes of his anger faded into the hallway and the door swung shut behind him, a strange and overwhelming quiet filled the restaurant. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from fear or tension. It was the silence that follows truth, heavy, settling, almost sacred. The kind that makes people look at each other differently, like they have just witnessed something important, something that changes how they see the world and the people in it. The boys, those young men who had spent weeks mocking me, doubting me, judging me without ever really knowing me, stood there in a loose half-circle, shifting awkwardly, their eyes softer now, their shoulders lower, their expressions stripped of the arrogance they once carried so confidently. They didn't come toward me with hesitation or fear. They came with something else, something I never expected from them, something I had long ago stopped hoping for from anyone. Tyler stepped forward first. His usual smirk was gone. This time his mouth pulled into something humble, almost apologetic. His voice wasn't loud or performative. It came out quiet, steady, with a kind of respect I never imagined I would hear from him. "Henry," he said, lifting his chin just enough to meet my eyes, "you handled all this like a legend, man. We were fools, completely blind. We thought we knew everything, but we didn't know a damn thing." His words hit me harder than any insult ever had, because they were honest, because they were earned, because they came from a place that recognized what I had carried for so long, responsibility, loyalty, and wounds that had never truly healed. Darren shifted beside him, rubbing the back of his neck like a man struggling with the weight of his own conscience. He looked down at the floor before forcing himself to meet my gaze. "Yeah, mate, you showed more heart than all of us combined. We messed up, big time, and you didn't just deal with it. You stood there like you've been protecting people your whole life." They weren't performing. They weren't trying to save face. Their voices were raw with embarrassment, with guilt, with something that looked a lot like admiration. And what struck me most was not that they apologized, but how they apologized. As young men who realized they had been wrong and wanted to grow past it, that alone was worth more than any grand statement. Around us, the restaurant guests, people who had been nothing more than strangers a few hours earlier, began to clap. Not loud, not dramatic, no theatrics, just a soft, warm, gentle wave of acknowledgement. A sound that wrapped around me like a blanket I had forgotten existed. A sound that said they saw me. They saw what I had endured, what I had stood for, what I had protected, what I had refused to become even when others pushed me. It wasn't applause for a hero. It wasn't applause for a victim. It was applause for a man who had simply done the right thing, again and again, even when nobody noticed, even when nobody cared. Mason stepped closer to me, the young man who had stood bravely under the weight of truth, who had spoken with a strength that reminded me of men twice his age. He smiled at me, not a small smile, not a polite one, but a smile filled with pride. Pride in me, pride in what he had witnessed, pride in the fact that he had finally spoken the truth his father left behind. "Sir," he said softly, You earned every single bit of this. And not just tonight. You earned it through all the years you protected people who never even knew it, through all the times you stepped up, through every moment you put yourself between danger and someone who needed you. Something shifted inside my chest then, something heavy, something that had slept for years without being touched, a part of me that had been buried beneath humiliation, judgment, betrayal, and the long loneliness of being misunderstood. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt something old rising, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Respect. Not forced respect. Not pity. Not fear disguised as politeness. Real, genuine, earned respect. Respect that comes when truth finally comes out of the shadows. Respect that comes when lies collapse. Respect that comes when a man's character speaks louder than anything his enemies could fabricate. And in that moment, surrounded by young men who looked at me not with mockery but with admiration, surrounded by strangers who clapped softly like they understood something important had happened tonight, I felt a warmth in my chest that nearly brought tears to my eyes. A warmth I had long forgotten. What happened next surprised me even more. As the night wound down and the restaurant began to close, Mason approached me again. His expression had changed, not nervous, not scared, but serious, deeply serious. He told me he needed to talk to me privately, something important, something he couldn't say in front of the others. He asked me to stay behind after everyone left. So I waited. I didn't know what he wanted to tell me. I didn't know why his expression had shifted. I didn't know why his voice held a hint of gravity that wasn't there before. All I knew was that the most shocking truth of the entire night, the truth that would shake me deeper than Marcus's lies, deeper than the boy's apologies, deeper than any of the chaos that had unfolded, was still ahead. And I had no idea just how much it would change everything. When the restaurant finally emptied out, when the last chair scraped across the floor and the final echoes of conversation faded into the quiet hum of the night, Mason stayed behind. He didn't rush. He didn't fidget. He simply sat across from me with that calm seriousness that doesn't belong to most people his age. For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just looked down at his hands, clasped together, breathing slow and steady as though gathering the courage to reveal something heavy, something that had been sitting on his chest for years. At last he took a deep breath. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud or emotional. It was soft, steady, and painfully honest. "Sir, I never told you something important, something I've carried for a long time." I sat still, waiting, not pushing him, not rushing him. There was something about his tone that told me the truth he was about to share wasn't small. It wasn't casual. It wasn't just another piece of tonight's chaos. It was something deeper. He exhaled slowly as though releasing years of silence. "My father left the construction world because of Marcus," he said. "Marcus blamed him for the mistake he himself made. He destroyed my father's name. He humiliated him. He turned other workers against him. My father only stayed employed. He only survived because of one thing, because of you." My heart stopped for a moment. A stillness spread through me like someone had opened an old wound I didn't know was still there. I blinked, trying to absorb his words, but Mason wasn't finished. "My father kept all the notes from that job site," he continued. "Every detail, every repair he made, every time Marcus cut corners, every time you stepped in to prevent a disaster. My dad told me. He told me you were the only reason he didn't lose everything. You stood up for him when no one else would. You defended him. You believed him when Marcus tried to turn the whole site against him." I felt my throat tight, the kind of tightness that comes from memories resurfacing long after you thought they had disappeared. I remembered those days, long, hot days, loud machinery screaming in the background, paperwork piling up, tensions high. I remembered stepping in, not because I wanted to be a hero, not because I needed recognition, but because it was the job, because a foreman protects his crew. That was the rule. That was the code. That was the heart of the work. But I never knew what happened afterward. I never knew Marcus's lies had driven Mason's father out entirely. I never knew the bitterness, the humiliation, the quiet destruction that followed him home. I only did what any decent man would have done. But for Mason and his father, that small act had been life-changing. I had no idea, I whispered, my voice barely finding its way out. I didn't know it cut that deep. I didn't know what he went through after. Mason gave a small, sad smile. He never blamed you, not once. He blamed Marcus. He blamed the system. He blamed the people who believed lies over truth. But he always said one thing about you. That man has heart. That man stands his ground. That man protects people. And tonight, I wanted to pay back even a small piece of what you did for him. Not because you needed it. Not because I felt sorry for you, but because you deserved it. Because respect should be passed forward. His words washed over me like warm water over stone, soft, but heavy with meaning, shaping me in ways I didn't expect. I felt the weight of years settle onto my shoulders, but it wasn't the weight of pain or regret. It was the weight of purpose, of legacy, of understanding that the small things we do, things we don't even think twice about, can ripple through someone's life for decades. Good years, hard years, honest years, all of them leading to this moment. And standing there in that dim, quiet restaurant, looking into the eyes of a young man whose respect was earned not through fear, not through authority, but through truth and history, something powerful unfolded in me. A truth older than scars, older than rumors, older than any lie Marcus had tried to build. Age does not make a man weak. Age gives a man history. Age gives him strength. Age gives him experience. Age gives him a legacy that no liar can erase. And in that moment, I understood the real lesson of the night. People will judge you quickly. People will mock you without reason. People will cling to rumors long before they search for truth. People will follow the loudest voice, even when it's the most dangerous one. But real character, true character, outlasts every rumor, every lie, every storm. People may not see it at first. They may not appreciate it. They may not understand it. But truth always waits. And when the time is right, truth arrives with a power no one can deny. As I walked out into the cool night air, the wind brushing gently against my face, the distant hum of traffic fading into background noise, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because Marcus was gone, not because applause had filled the room, not because the boys now looked at me with admiration, but because something inside me had finally settled. Respect had returned. Dignity had returned. Truth had returned. And the young men who once laughed at me now saw me clearly, not as an old man past his prime, not as a story they could mock, but as someone worth listening to, someone with value, someone with heart. This was my story. The night they said I was too old, too slow, too outdated, too easy to dismiss. And the night I proved that age has nothing to do with worth, nothing to do with strength, nothing to do with integrity. Worth comes from the heart. Strength comes from character. Respect comes from truth. And on that night, truth finally stood tall.